So how do you feel about the latest developments in Palestine, or the Palestines? We've always said we were going to talk about this. Let's hit this.
Oh, yeah, we did. Let's do. You mean President Bush's trip, the meeting with the Israeli Prime Minister, meeting with the President of the Palestinian Authority, pronouncements. He's gone on to Saudi Arabia and then gone on to, where is it, Abu Dhabi or something like that.
That's right.
Giving a speech about Iran and so forth. How do I feel about it? Well, it's a big, complicated issue. I will only echo pundits who've said this many times now, that it's rather late in the day for Bush announcing that before his presidency is over, he expects there to be a signed peace agreement. What I read of the commentary from various sources sympathetic to both sides of that conflict is that that's a pipe dream. People don't believe it. Think that it's very unlikely. The position of the United States in the region, in the aftermath of the fiasco in Iraq and of the threat that Iran poses, the complex alliances that we have with the various Arab governments, the Gulf states, Saudi, and so on, our difficulty in being a honest broker in the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, because our position has been so biased in favor of the Israeli side. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean, I guess I need prompting. I don't want to just sort of hold forth. I mean, what is it that we are to talk about? I mean, there was a war in Lebanon a couple of years ago that I thought was horrific. Mm-hmm. There is this constant back and forth between there is Gaza Strip, there is the occupation in the West Bank, there is the nature of Israeli politics, the nature of the Israeli right, peace movement in Israel, and so forth. I mean, there are a lot of things to say. There's the Israel lobby in the United States.
Well, to be more specific, there is a question. Like, obviously, the things that have gone on between Israel and the Palestinians have been a hideous thing to see. And as I said before, I really wish that there had been some hypothetical scenario where those two peoples did not have to meet on that stage. But now that they're there, I found it interesting to read today about what's been going on in, for example, the Gaza Strip. And you're having these Qassam rockets being sent into the village of Sderot. And there was an interview in the media with a guy named Shimon Amar on the Israeli side, and he was saying that he would rather that Israelis live the way people are living in Sderot, with this constant bombing, being afraid to go outside, not wanting to turn your lights on at night sometimes for fear of being a target, than sending people into the Gaza Strip to be torn apart and end up fighting, etc. So the idea is to stay behind the wall, so to speak, rather than, for example, sending young people in to be killed making statements. And it seems to me that although the Israelis really shouldn't have built the settlements, for example, and while there are all sorts of abuses that go on a mano level, I do find myself wishing that the Palestinians felt more like Shimon Amar, or felt more like, say, the Kurds up in Kirkuk, where they were forcibly displaced by Saddam Hussein, by Arabs, and now, instead of sending suicide bombers into Arabic-speaking territories, they're being patient, they're biding their time, they have a future plan, but it's not about sending young people in to kill themselves as if not having what they want means that there's no reason to live. And so in one of the previous discussions we've had, I was saying that I find there to be negatives on both sides of that conflict, and that's not a way of saying that Israel is absolutely horrible and hooray for the Palestinians, except a slap on the hand. I see real problems on both sides. I get equally angry at both sides, and I have found sometimes that saying that gets some people extremely upset. I'm sure you can imagine. But it seems to me that there are hypothetical different ways that the Palestinians could deal with their fate that are not always discussed enough.
Yeah, I don't doubt that that's true. I'm sure there's plenty to be said in support of the position that you've just taken, which is to say that, there are problems on both sides. That's not That's not my sentiment, though. Although I don't deny the objective, value in that. My sense is that there's really more blame to be put on the Israeli than the Palestinian side of this question, and that will get me in trouble with people, friends of mine, in fact. But my sense is that when I sort of step back and look at the thing, at the full thing, including the events that transpired in Europe, which were not the fault of the people who live in Palestine, but are nevertheless, during the war, relevant to this. I'm talking about the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about the extermination of European Jewry. Mm-hmm. So the aspiration for the establishment of a homeland for the Jewish people, which of course predates the war by generations, mm-hmm. and which was playing itself out on the ground in conflict between nationalist aspiring Zionists who were coming to Palestine to settle, and the population indigenous there of Palestinian Arabs who were under a kind of colonial dispensation in search of some sense of their own national aspiration, mm-hmm. which develops necessarily in this kind of juxtaposition to the Zionist goal of establishing a Jewish state. And I think about on this little tiny strip of land that's no bigger than a small American state, and the millions of people who are crowded in there who are, yes, of different cultural and religious and sort of ethnic identity traditions, but who have a great deal more in common in their humanity than they have that separates them. And I think about the tragedy. I think about the tragedy of 6 decades of people living in camps, of being dispossessed, pushed out of their homes, fleeing for their lives, turned into refugees, and unable to return. And I think about the politics and the ideology of the post-1967 occupation of the territories that were conquered by Israel in that war. An occupation and settlement movement that's now become integrated into at least a significant part of the political psyche and identity of the country. The things that I read about the discussion of that occupation and the discussion of how to deal with the Arab and Muslim people who happen to live within the territory of Greater Israel, the discussion in Israeli politics that I read about transfer now, the attitude of settlers like the ones who are in the city of Hebron and in the hills south of Hebron toward the indigenous population there, the machinations to acquire and to control more and more of that land, and in the name of the security to control more and more of the lives, the livelihood, the movement, the security, and the peace of mind of those people who live there, mm-hmm. many of them cowering. When I think about what Gaza Strip actually is, mm-hmm. this huge city of over 1 million people who are crammed into this little tiny strip of land and who are, as I say, monitored and controlled. It's a big, huge prison camp to a certain degree. Mm-hmm. I think that our Western allies, the nation of enlightenment. I mean, I've heard beautiful classical music, performed by symphony in Jerusalem. I've been in the university there at Tel Aviv and at Jerusalem in conversation with my colleagues. I know the influence and the reach of Israeli scholars, of artists, of novelists and writers who are a part of our culture and a part of our civilization. They are, in many cases, our fellow citizens as well, who are also deeply connected to Israel. I hold them to a higher standard, in a sense. I think that our ideas about democracy, freedom, and liberty, the kind of enlightenment ideals that animate our own sense of ourselves as a city on a hill, have to apply in Israel and Palestine. Mm-hmm. And they, the idea of the political and the theological that come together there, the idea that we're going to have a state that's reserved, it rubs against certain senses, a certain sense of equality of political equality of persons for me, even though I understand what it means in the context of the historical narrative of the Jewish people. So it's a tough one for me. But at the end of the day, I'm feeling, I wish that my buddies, my friends, my colleagues, my cousins, who are a part of our political and our, ideological, cultural civilization here, who are a part of the West, who are a part of us. Yeah. I wish that they were making a better example in that part of the world for how to do this.
But all we have, unfortunately, is the present, no matter how hideous the past was. And you talk about holding people to a standard. And as far as I'm concerned, it's pretty simple. Camp David, the offer was 96% of the West Bank. Not 95, 96% of the West Bank. You get the Gaza Strip. You get an extra 3% of Israel itself. You get East Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, and a $30 billion settlement for the displaced. And instead, the Palestinians walk away because there was not the right of return. They couldn't compromise on that, so they didn't want all of that. Now, that is something that the West and Israel tried to present. That was the idea, and it seemed to me that this was very progressive. Now, it wasn't perfect, but what exactly is? We only have the present to deal with. And that was just rejected. To me, that was as regrettable as, for example, the fact that the settlements have been pushed in the first place, or the way the wall has been put in in unjust places in others. And so that's exactly it. It's just like I sometimes ask some people, how come you don't hate Saddam Hussein as much as you hate Dick Cheney? In the same way, I am as disappointed by that walkaway and other things as I am by the evils on the side of the people, the Israelis, who are more like us. I'm trying to hold them all to a moral standard.
Now, let's talk about this a bit further then. I don't know about Camp David and their rejection. I mean, people have different opinions about that. Jimmy Carter in his book actually argues differently, for example, although, of course, Jimmy Carter has an agenda, strong point of view. Yeah. His book, Peace Not Apartheid, that's correct, his controversial book. I don't know, and people have said that the original UN declaration or mandate, whatever it was called, that would have partitioned Palestine into... No, I'm talking about the original partition plan. The Palestinian people might have accepted it. It would have given them a much bigger... and more contiguous territory. If they, I'm talking about in 1947. In 1947.
Yeah.
But instead they rejected it, and they rejected it, as I understand it, from what little I know of this, on the ideological ground that they didn't acknowledge the UN's right to divide their country between these interlopers who they thought
why should they?
Didn't have a right, didn't have an equal right to, etc.
And there was a point to that.
And with sure, there's rejectionists, and there's much more. This culture of death, yes. The violence and the terrorism. Yes, absolutely. The insecurity of people who are Israelis who are living under the threat of this violence, I understand it. Although, as things have developed, what I'm seeing now, what appears to me to be the case, I look at this war in Lebanon last
couple years ago,
summer as an example. I'm thinking, summer before last, I should say. I'm thinking, Israel's security, yes, but it looks like the Israelis are pretty capable of keeping themselves secure. It looks like they have military dominance in the area. In fact, it looks to me like the people who are really suffering from insecurity, from violence, and from so forth and so on are these people who are, for example, cowering in the bottom of some structure in southern Lebanon that's being bombed by an aggressive Israeli force, or who are the subject of the depredations of this occupation on the West Bank and the military control over their lives, which has just completely decimated them. So, I mean, yes, there's security, yes. Security, though, through a political settlement that acknowledges the rights of the Palestinians and so forth and so on, or security through a wall that tries to, protect ourselves by keeping the other guy on the other side, regardless of what the consequences of that, both for our political ideals as well as for the lives of those people. I still have to say at the end of the day that I'm disappointed in my Israeli friends, colleagues, and cousins, and society in the way in which they're dealing with this issue.
It's the one thing is that you make it sound like the Israelis started the Lebanon conflict. Do we have different information? Because I thought that this was something that started with the other side, and the Israelis responded, and one can quibble about the appropriateness of their response and whether they targeted civilians, but it wasn't as if this just came up out of the blue.
Well, as with everything else, there's dispute about that. What I hear the people on the other side saying is that, yes, the kidnappings took place, but the lobbing of the missiles didn't actually, from the Hezbollah into Israel, didn't actually get going until the Israelis made the first aggressive military move. But I really don't want to go there. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not. First of all, I'm not well enough informed to argue chapter and verse about this or that. Mm-hmm. And secondly, I would say, however the conflict started, Israeli fighter bombers at 30,000 feet over residential areas of Beirut, destroying infrastructure, killing fleeing civilians on the road, massacring large numbers of women and children and old people cowering in the basements of their homes. I would say 1 million refugees in Lebanon. I would say the full force of the Israeli military unleashed against that society in an effort to extirpate the Hezbollah, who are still there.
Mm-hmm.
The attack on the Shia Muslim community, an ethnic religious community of Lebanon, by the ethno-religious community nation of Israel, it looked like guys with slingshots versus guys with automatic weapons. That's what it looked like to me, and that's how the body count came out.
I hear you, and I mean, my point is simply that there are different ways of responding to occupation or being in a conflict with a heavily armed first world power than what we're seeing. And I think we see that, for example, in what you could call Kurdistan. There are alternatives that aren't being taken. But actually, the other topic that I think we were supposed to talk about, I'm not sure how much time we have left.
I think they'll give us the time that we take, John.
Okay.
We're that big.
Because, we are so important, are we?
Or maybe I should say you were that big and I'm just carrying on the coattails.
Oh, I feel it's the other way. But we said we were going to do Palestine, and we said that we were going to discuss Come On People by Bill Cosby and Alvin Poussin, the idea being that there are things that can be done in the black community despite the fact that the world isn't perfect. And if you by chance had a chance to look it over, I was wondering what you thought about the usefulness of that book as opposed to the more plangent ways of looking at things that we're more used to.
Yeah, I looked at the book, and of course we're not finished talking about Palestine. The issues got a lot that one could say about it, but we don't have to try to say it all in one breath. But as far as Cosby and Poussin are concerned, I looked at the book, Come On People, and it's an easy read. I mean, I can see that it could sit in a house of a not especially well-educated or very big reader type person, and it would get picked up and thumbed through, and people would hang with it, and they might read it with their kids, or they might talk about it over the kitchen table or whatever it is. It's folksy. It's practical. It's down there. It's got, a lot of how-to kind of stuff in
Concrete advice.
And, it's how can you but be for it? I mean, if I pick up a nonfiction paperback bestseller list, half the books on there are going to be self-help books about how to lose weight or how to be successful in your managerial career, or
you sound like you're
how to be the man or the woman or the teenager or the sex pot that you want to be. It's good. So this is, I see it in that in a way.
You make it sound like it was written by Suze Orman or something. Isn't it more important than that? Isn't it a very special book in its very concrete advice, such as, and my favorite part of that book is that it talks about how if you do not have a high school diploma, it is not true that the only thing you're going to do is mow the lawn or sell drugs on the corner, which is really what a lot of very smart people are saying, and sometimes in very clear language. Listening to Gary Orfield at Harvard, for example, he explains how those signs that you see on trains for all those vocational schools actually apply in this case. You can get a GED. It is very often not terribly expensive. You can go to school to learn how to be a machinist or a dental hygienist or a building inspector or any number of things, and you can have a trade. And most importantly, these are not things where the most that you can make is $31,000 a year. You can actually live a middle-class existence. Now, there's nothing punitive about this, but this is information that a great many people really don't know. And that self-help book, I mean, you're making it sound like it's something by, Wayne Dyer or something like that, or Dr. Phil. This self-help book actually can explain to people who need help how to make the best of yourself despite the fact that you went to a lousy school, you grew up in a lousy neighborhood, you don't feel like going to college and learning about Shakespeare. I think that this book is unique in that way. There have been plenty of self-help books written for black people over the years. This one, because of its format and how well written it is and because of who wrote it, I think is poised to become something more significant.
Well, they have a booster. I can see that.
Yeah.
And, if it were to sell 2 million copies and it were really to end up on every other African-American bookshelf, I can't see that would be a bad thing. I'm not against it at all. But I really don't. First of all, I don't know that there's any new information there. You say it's new information that you can go to a community college and learn how to run an MRI machine, or that you can sign up at one of these commercial tech schools and maybe even get a Pell Grant to help you pay
Do you
for
think that information is
be a
out
machinist
there?
or an electrician.
Yeah.
Come on. These my sense of it. I'm certainly no expert.
You know it.
Is that the enrollments in these trade schools are quite high.
Yeah.
And there are some issues about fraud. Not all of these things are on the up and up and so forth. But by and large, that they're quite high. That they're helping people and that people are getting jobs. And that I don't know that that's something that a high school counselor can't tell a kid in an exit interview on his way out.
No, you know that you can stand up in front of any community group or in any college classroom and say something along the lines of, the schools are churning out undereducated young men who have nothing to do but the corners because the market will not employ them. There's bigotry against young black men, and everybody breaks out into applause. And I know that you have at least had a phase where you listened to hip-hop. I don't know if you still do, but you can hear that on a great many hip hop albums that unless
John,
and so I think it's not.
You're fighting I think I don't like the way you're arguing. I mean, I can point to people who are going to say silly things, but that doesn't mean that that's a widely held view. And I the idea that there are no jobs out there for people. I think that's wrong. I mean, I've been, and I don't think it's a widely held view. I don't think it's a widely held view amongst. It's a cliche. I mean, anyway, let me talk about the book. Let me go back to Cosby and Poussin.
Okay.
Because you say it's important.
Mm-hmm.
It's an important book. I mean, you think it's really going to change something?
Could change something.
I don't. You say Gary Orfield. I mean, now, who is people don't have to know who Gary Orfield is. He's a professor at Harvard of Education who writes about the deleterious consequences of segregation in America's schools and who argues that segregation has been increasing and that the Supreme Court has abandoned racial integration as a goal and an objective and so forth, and who would have to be counted on the liberal side of the political spectrum. I think when I hear the name Gary Orfield, and you've mentioned Jonathan Kozol in the past, a left-wing writer about schools whose book Savage Inequality was popular some time ago, and other books that he's written. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking, and then you hold up Cosby and Poussin. Look, there's hope after high school dropout. I'm thinking a couple of things. First of all, I'm thinking
more in it than that.
School reform is desperately needed in this country, and changing the way that we finance schools and creating a more level playing field so that all of our children have something closer to an equal opportunity to learn is a serious goal of reform. We can argue about how to do it. They're conservative, they're liberal solutions. I'm not going to solutions right now. I'm just talking about the aspiration of reform versus, the nostrum. If you've dropped out, if you got a bad school, it's not over yet because you can still do something. I'm talking about the political aspiration of institutional reform versus preaching to people.
Oh, shit. No, that's just it. It's not necessarily, the word preach is very loaded. But for example, let's say that you're going to a rather tatty school. Now, the inconvenient fact that everybody's aware of, no matter what side of the political spectrum they're on, is that immigrant kids, and yes, I'm going to bring up immigrant kids go to those schools, and very often their parents make the best of their education there. It's something that's inculcated in the culture. Now, really, they shouldn't have to work that hard, but they do. Now, we're all aware of the cases where the parents don't speak English well and they're afraid. There are those cases, too. But there are other ones where you see, say, the kid from, Bangladesh, it wouldn't be Bangladesh, but from Pakistan or something like that, really excelling in the school and getting the most out of it through active efforts, through things that their parents do, whereas that's not happening with the native-born kids. Now, if Cosby and Poussin have a section of their book where they just explain some things that you might do so that you can make the best of your school, even if it's not the kind of school where they're just going to put it into your lap, I don't call that preaching, especially since the tone of the book is rather loving. It's not preaching. It's to show that there is something we can do other than hoping that funding will be equal. Because even though those political efforts are important, they happen very, very slowly. And the fact is that the person who is sitting in their living room has more control over what they can do to make the most out of the school that they happen to live near than they do over what's going to happen in the State House over the course of 10 years.
Let me give you an analogy, John. I think what you just said is fair enough. But let me give you an analogy. So a woman is raped She is sexually assaulted brutally. It is a complete and it's a total injustice that she has been raped. And it could ruin her life. It certainly adversely affects her life. She's traumatized by it. Now, someone comes to her in a counseling session. She goes into a depression after this event. It's 6 months later. She's put on weight. She's let herself go. She can't get out of the bed. She's paranoid and afraid. And someone says, look, you're the only person who can really solve this problem. And what you have to do is you have to get yourself up and you have to get moving. One foot in front of the other. We're going to get you some support. We're going to get you some therapy, whatever, but it's ultimately on you. You're the one who has to do it. Now, that you were raped was a profound injustice, and it's also profoundly irrelevant to what you're going to do tomorrow morning. All right? It seems to me that it's a speech a little bit like that, the spirit of, in any which, that you're giving right now to Black America, and you're saying, people, come on, with Cosby and Poussin, and you're saying, I know what has been. It wasn't always just. Maybe school should have been funded a little bit differently, whatever. But you know what? There's something that you can do. These guys have laid it out for you. The immigrants who come here and who don't really have a claim are doing it. They show that it can be done. And I use the analogy because, of course, that's right. What you say is right. The imperative of agency, of taking responsibility for our own lives, of acting, and not just grousing or waiting for someone else to act, is absolutely compelling in this situation. I don't deny that for a moment. And to the extent that this text by Cosby and Poussin could be helpful in that, more power to them. But the analogy suggests to me that there's more to this conversation, right? I mean, about the rape victim, one wants also to say, what about the society, the background of the society, the structures in that society which gave rise to that act? What about the denigration of women casually and so forth and so on? What about the lack of security that might have been provided for this person? What about the fact that, et cetera, and then you go on in that vein. And there could be a movement of women. They might want to take back the night. They might be picketing at the state legislature, demanding, or at the news channel, that the coverage be different, or in the courthouse, or whatever it might be, trying to bring about structural political change that would make it so that women like this particular woman, who needs to get up and get her life moving again, wouldn't so often have to be in that situation. It doesn't seem to me that you refute this latter concern by pointing to the former. The former existential imperative is clear enough.
Yes.
But the social and collective and political responsibilities are still there, and they still call to us.
Glenn, your analogy is absolutely perfect. That is exactly the way it is. I'm more comfortable using an analogy of somebody who gets hit by a truck and they can't walk. But okay, let's make it something as especially hideous as rape. And here is what I say in response to what you said. Of course, one wants to have structures in place. Like, for example, before sexual harassment was a standard term, it's striking to think that in the era of old movies, you would have women who would say, don't go into a room with him alone, he's all hands, and that was supposed to be funny. What that meant was that he was what we would now consider somebody who would sexually harass you, or somebody who would date rape you. There was not a term. We have moved along in that way. People can be prosecuted for behavior which would have been just winked at as late as the 1970s. Take back the night is important. The dialogue has moved, legislation has moved, but this is the crucial thing. I'm not saying that those things aren't important. They're certainly part of the mix. But imagine a society where those things were the only thing that was going on, the thing that the smartest people were taking the most seriously, and in the meantime, when you were sitting couchside or bedside with the person who had suffered from a rape, it was considered kind of pushing the envelope or punitive or preachy to say to this woman, in the meantime, while Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin are working on their books and pushing their legislation, and while we're learning new things, you are the one who has to heal yourself because the world's going to keep spinning. Imagine if people who did that were considered, let's say, conservative or unfeeling, because that's the situation that we have now. Cosby and Poussin write this very simple book telling a very simple truth, which you have explained. Basically, agency matters. But here we are discussing that as if there's any question as to whether or not that is crucial. It seems to me that many people, in looking at a book like Come On People as nervy, as questionable, as a gesture, are arguing for a society in which also people being raped would just lay depressed and sad and unhealed, and that would be thought of as almost a healthy statement to a society that needs to start making laws faster about rape. So when we talk about the priority, what matters to me is that we realize that the agency has to be something that there's a fire under us about as much as the legislation, because the legislation happens slowly, and in the meantime, individuals are individuals. We move ourselves. Does that make sense?
It does almost. I mean, it does considerably, but there's something that I want to add. I don't want to go against what you've been saying, because agency matters is correct.
It's key.
It's
right.
true. It's definitely true. And, I've said it before, I've said it again, God bless them, Cosby and Poussaint. May they flourish in what they endeavor to do. And the but here is, these things are not, you say, priority, right? I mean, what we're going to put first and what we're going to put second. And I'm not sure that's the right way to think about it, because these things are, they are interconnected. And the word politics keeps coming to my mind. So it's not politics when I advise the victim of the truck or the rape that come now, we have to get to the physical therapy, or we have to get to the psychological, emotional therapy. Mm-hmm. We've got to get ourselves moving. It's on you. You're the only person who can do this. You've got to pick yourself up and go forward. Let's get going. Mm-hmm. That's not politics. You know what I mean? That's advising a person about what they need to do in their life.
Right.
It's absolutely essential. It's an important thing to do.
Yeah.
But it doesn't. Here's where I'm going with this. What I'm going with this is it doesn't entail mutual obligations amongst persons in the society.
Yeah.
It doesn't go to the question of what we do together, what our laws should be, what our taxes should be, what our relative priorities should be about this or that thing. And it's that debate. It's the political debate and the racial inequality, poverty, welfare, ghettos, etc. All of that. What America should do. What kind of country are we? You've heard me use these words, I know. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to quote myself. I just want to say the question on the table, in addition to the need to get the lethargy out of the way, to sort of shock people, or to seduce them, or persuade them, or inspire them into forward motion in their own lives. This is important. I don't want to say it's less important. I don't want to say it's more important. I just want to say it's important and distinct from the imperative to get our community to think in more expansive ways about our mutual obligations to one another. And my concern is, to the extent that the latter, communal, and I say civic, I mean political, I mean collective of the United States population, to that agenda gets pushed to the side because of the other. They interact with each other. People will say, well, you see, Cosby has already shown us if only these people would pick up that book and get themselves moving,
you're so afraid of this. Yeah.
We wouldn't have a problem anymore. Pardon?
You're so afraid of that if we stress responsibility, I don't use that word responsibility, but if we stress responsibility too much, then the powers that be will give up. And, of course, there will always be people who say that. I mean, if Barack Obama became president, what you would end up dealing with all the time is people saying, well, now that there's a black president, what's everybody bellyaching about? Let's just all go on to other things. There will always be people who say those things. But is there really a danger in this country, since we've come this far, since there's certain patterns set, that all efforts to help people who have been left behind, and particularly black people, are just going to fall away? That we're just going to have this consensus among smart-thinking people that we just need to let it go? Is academia, for example, really going to let go of it? Is there going to be nobody in government who's truly committed to things like this? I don't see the danger of that the way you do.
Yeah, and you challenge me in an important way, and it'll sound like a cop-out, but this is not the time or the place for me to try to answer it fully. I mean, you challenge me to say, all right, Loury, you're drawing a connection between one conversation and another conversation. Between a conversation about personal responsibility, if you want to use those terms, about agency, about the imperative thereof, and what can be done despite, on the one hand, and then a conversation about what yet, of all the progress that we've made, and we have made some, but it's been fitful, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, whatever, what else remains to be done about our schools, about our cities, etc. So you challenge me to say, if I feel that second progressive conversation is going to get spoiled by the first, then spell it out. Is it really true? Because couldn't you have both conversations going in a felicitous manner at the same time? You argue.
Yeah.
My instinct is that it's not the case, as you say, that the imperative for reform, in the sense that we are responsible, I don't know what, for a 15-year-old who runs around our city streets with a gun and then has to be dealt with by our courts, or that we're responsible for, I don't know what, a subculture of, I don't know, pathology, alienation, violence, and the rest that one might find around drug trafficking or in some corners of hip-hop culture or whatever it is. The sense that these cities are products of our collective making when we decided how to do the suburbs, how to build the interstates, how to finance our school system, where to draw the boundaries over time, over generations, that we're all somehow implicated in it. My fear is that sense that people are going to come to in a very difficult way anyway, that they'll be reluctant to embrace. Then they're given an excuse not to embrace it. They're given an excuse to say, really, there are two Americas here, just like John Edwards says. You're darn right, there are two Americas, and we're going to keep the bad one, on the other side of our gate or on the other side of our wall. Doesn't have anything to do with us. Let's lock them up and throw away the key.
Glenn, you're expecting an awful lot of people. I mean, really, here's where we find a real difference. I hear you. I see what you mean. But, Glenn, if you're really expecting that Mr. and Ms. America are going to look at the 15-year-old, and let's nail it, the 15-year-old brown or black kid with a gun, and let's say that the kid unfortunately used it, and they're truly going to feel in their gut that the cause of that was highways being built and the suburbs and the way they were, and let's say factories moving away. If you think that we're going to get to a point that it's our job to make Mr. and Ms. America truly feel that the responsibility for what the 15-year-old kid did is policies from the 50s and the 60s, then we have completely different views of how Homo sapiens actually thinks. There's wonky people, there are academics, there are political junkies, but that is a tiny minority of people who are out there getting by, buying groceries and doing their jobs. And so if you are seeking a political consensus in this country, kind of going down to the bar stools along those lines, Glenn, I wish you well. But talk about instinct. I do not
you're right.
see that.
We are getting to the point here. I agree with you. I think this is very useful because we sort of hovered around this conversation on a previous occasion, and I detected your sense that, man, what a Pollyanna. And that is your thought that my hope for reform was really, a
remarkable faith in the human,
a fairy tale, as they say.
I wouldn't call it that.
So let me respond to that, because you could be right, John. You well could be right, but I object to this line of art. I mean, I know it very well from my old days as a neocon, right? Mugged by reality. Right, suspicious about the extent to which the kind of far-reaching, very idealistic, theoretical vision of society that is the bread and butter of people like me who teach courses and write books for a living. Suspicious about the extent to which that extended to the everyday man. Trusting the common sense of the guy who just got mugged, of the cab driver who just got robbed, of the guy who lives in the suburbs whose mother lives back in the old neighborhood because it's close to the synagogue, and somebody snatched a perch on the way, and he's pissed off. And worse, somebody who's been beaten, somebody who's been raped, somebody who's been murdered, someone whose child has been murdered. They went to the university, New Haven, Hyde Park, Chicago, whatever it was. They went to get a pizza or a sub sandwich, and somebody shot them dead. And now their 19-year-old golden-haired kid is dead. And they're angry. They're furious.
And somebody says it's the fault of the highways built under the Eisenhower administration. I don't think so.
Right. And so then all this abstract, social theoretic, I'm going to explain this, whatever, you can't expect that to penetrate into the consciousness of this person. Believe me, I get that. I get that that's the way they are. That's the way many people are. Many people who are just going to punch that clock, who are just going to go and have a beer at lunchtime, who are just trying to get by.
Most human beings are not intellectuals. Right.
And who are not going to, who haven't drunk the Kool-Aid, who et cetera. But my idea, and maybe it is Pollyannish, maybe it really is utopian. My idea is that everyday sensibility which is not very deep. I mean, it's not very reflective. It doesn't really ask what the right thing is. I mean, why should anybody want to pay? We shouldn't want to pay taxes either. I mean, all right, if I can think about it, but that it's susceptible to being elevated. I'm sorry to use this language because it may offend people. I don't want to offend. But what I'm saying is, if you're going around thinking, what's it got to do with me? The bum is a 15-year-old. He suffers from moral poverty. His parents should have raised him right. He got a gun in his hand, fry him. And if you're not saying, how are we as a society implicated in the larger structures that give rise to this problem? If you're not saying that, let me just finish my thought before I add another one. Then you have an impoverished view of the situation. I mean, how can we be moral or ethical in our behavior if we simply go with our gut? If we simply go with the thing that's the first thing that we think? And that the role for political leadership in education, again, I know how this sounds to certain people. That's going to remind them of communist re-education, and their eyes are going to roll back in their heads, but I'm going to persist. The role of leadership, the reason that you write books and that you do studies of this kind and that you try to articulate these ideas is to try to raise people's sights, to try to get them to see the problem in a different light.
Sure, but there are limits.
Yes, that's tough work, but we can do it. And as I've said before,
to an extent.
When we look at other areas of American society where we have done it, when we look at the women's movement, for example, where it has been done, you could say,
Glenn,
et cetera.
I know you have another thought now. I just want to interject. You're right. There are things that can be done, but I don't think either one of us know exactly where you can draw the line. I would say that there is a line when you're talking about the white woman who is a cashier at Walmart and how culpable she's going to feel about this 15-year-old boy. What you're saying makes sense theoretically, but what are the chances in this particular case of making enough of an impact to really matter? Continue.
I'm saying we want to say to her and to people like her that this kid's not really all that different from yourself. If you're not a single mom, you know one. Everybody is struggling. If it wasn't crack cocaine, then maybe it was methamphetamine or maybe it was alcohol, whatever it was. Okay? He went to a shitty dead-end high school. You went to one that's like it too. Okay? What we're trying to do here is create a compact in the society that we can embody and reflect in our institutions, where we can pull together and where we can accept collective responsibility for the things that properly fall within our collective ambit. How we finance our schools, how we run our cities, what our priorities are for our public spending, whom we tax and to what extent. These are things that we're deciding together. And, of course, I mean, I'm not going to make her say the kid that went into the 7-Eleven is her fault. It's her fault because she wanted to live in a leafy suburb. I know you've written about this before. It's black middle-class people's fault that they moved out to a better life, to which you said that's nonsense. They moved out to a better life, just like everybody else. What did you want from them? Which is, of course, correct.
Glenn, listen to your wees.
So it's not to try to teach them. Pardon?
Your weeness that you're using here. You're making a speech where you sound exactly like a certain person who's running for the Democratic nomination, and it's not Hillary. I'm just mentioning this bit about the social compact. It's just something to think about.
I tell you what, John. Why don't we leave it at that? I think that's a good note to end on. We're not going to finish this argument today. We've been at this for an hour and a half. So
have we gone that long? Wow, it just zips by.
Yes, okay. It has been, John.
Yeah. No, this has been fun, but yeah, you sound just like him. It's something to think
about.
Well,
maybe I'll vote for him then. It's not over yet. Certainly, if he's a nominee, I'm going to vote for him.
Well, good.
Maybe I'm talking myself into something. I don't know.
This could go on, and I hope we do. I hope we do another one, and we have some interesting things to watch happening over the next couple of weeks in particular.
I'm sure we will. I'm sure we will, and I'll actually dig your Sun columns out. I've got you on my browser now. So.
Oh, good. Yeah, and I think I'm in the Wall Street Journal today, and so.
Oh, are you? Okay, I'll look for that.
Yeah. So yeah,
excellent. Congratulations. We ought to put a link up on the site to that.
Yeah, actually, I think I'm supposed to say that. Yeah, that should be done. So
you should probably send them the link. Why don't we sign off now?
Okay.
Until next time, a pleasure as always, John.
You too, Glenn.
Take care.
You too.